Okay, hey guys, welcome back to today's debate. We're on the motion of politics with the motion saying this House supports mandatory national service. So we're going to go into a little bit of military conscription and why this would be a good or bad idea to certain countries. Okay, let's go into definition because that's the most important thing. So when we're talking about mandatory, it means required by law or it's compulsory. So you have to do it. National service is a system of either compulsory or voluntary government service, usually military service. And the word that you will see very commonly in the reading this week would be conscription. So, conscription is actually the same meaning as mandatory national service, that you must go to military when you're above 18 and between certain ages. Okay, so that's the definition. So we're going to look into conscription. What is it? Well, conscription existed since pretty much the beginning of human history. So when you were working in a farm under a king, and then the king says, "Oh, we have a war between the next country," then obviously you don't have a choice, but you have to pick up the weapon and go and fight. And that was like the old ages type of conscriptions. But as we move on to the history and to the modern warfare, the countries during the times of war have created some conscription services. So one of the examples, obviously, there was World War One and World War Two in the modern history, where countries fought, and in order to supply the army, the country has asked and conscribed a mandatory military service to people who are 18 or older, and that's why hundreds of people died as a result of war. Vietnam War was also a conscription where US had to fight a war with Vietnam. Now, in order to do so, people registered and then they will put their names in this lottery that you see in the picture right now. And then when your name is out, you have no choice but to go to Vietnam. So you see people lined up to be conscribed and to be deployed into Vietnam after weeks of training. Okay, so that is how conscription works. The country calls you and you have to respond and fight for your own country. Now, not a lot of countries have conscription service or mandatory military service, and Korea is one of an example. North and South Korea have mandatory conscription service. So if you are a male citizen born in Korea, have a Korean passport, and when you come to a certain age, then you have to go to and fight in the war. Taiwan, Singapore, or other countries that have mandatory military service. In Europe, you have Norway, and certain countries in Middle East like Iraq, and some countries in South America have conscription service. But right now, there's around 30 countries or less that does conscription service. Now, fewer than around 5 to 4 countries have female conscription service as well. And one example is Israel, also North Korea. These countries require even women to be conscribed in the military service, and they would have training, and they will go have training to be to work in a military for a certain amount of time. So that's also there are some countries that does a man and woman mandatory military service. Okay, so of course the motion today does not really restrict conscription service to Korea, or it's not going to limit to only saying men. It can be man or woman. I think it depends on whether you're a proposition team, then it's really up to you to limit this to one country or expand it to more like a general idea, but that's up to you. That's up to you how you design. But when we think about why countries have military conscription, it's usually, well, these countries happen to be like North and South Korea, for example. We're not actively at war, but we're technically still at war between each other. Israel also happens to be surrounded by countries, and they had a record of war and do not have a lot of allies in the region. And that's why in those special situations, countries decide to have a military conscription, so they will have a stable army. And it also creates nationalism, a pride, where you are proud of a country because you actually give service to that country. So also the other part is, like I said, Korea, where it's technically at war, or take example of Singapore, where there isn't a lot of people and that's why you have to do conscription service in order to have an adequate number of army operating. So for countries that are in a unique situation of war, or the country itself is smaller in population and they must have meet a certain number of people, and voluntary when the voluntary service and military is not enough, then they have to do conscription service in order to have strong military structure of that nation. For personal goods, people do argue that if you go to military service, this is good because it can also create self-discipline, and there's a lot of individual benefits to it. We'll share more about this in the argument section. But there are definitely people who are against this idea of conscription. Definitely people who go for pacifism or peace, or based on their religious belief that uh, that prohibits you from holding a weapon or killing someone. These people, they're against their belief or rights to say that they have to be going into the army, and when the nation requires you to fight for an army, that's not going to be necessarily a good thing for that individual. Other people worry that if you do mandatory conscription service, then you might get hurt. Some people are not just fit for the army, because if you want to really be good in the army, you have to have certain types of characteristics, certain type of body structure. Those people do well in the army. Some people who are born weaker or might not have that capability might be more likely to get hurt or even lose their life as a result. So let's take an example of US. If US turns back into mandatory military service, some of these soldiers might be deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, and then they'll be killed. And there's so much risk to it if you're going to send the people by mandatory to a place of war zone. Lastly, we can also see some people who are really famous, like BTS or famous athletes. If they have to go to military, it is not necessarily good for them because they are at the height of their career. So when you're a famous singer or when you're doing really well, but then when the nation asks you to go to an army and you will have just 2 or 3 years that you have to be in the army, it's going to be a setback for you, because other people who don't need to go to army will easily overtake you or take your career opportunities. And that's why there has been some petitions. When BTS became very, very famous worldwide as a sensation, some Korean people have petitioned that BTS should be exempt from the mandatory military service because they contribute a lot to that nation. Likewise, this can be a blocker for those who wants to aspire to do well in their career, and military conscription can be something that can be, a blocker for them. So, do you agree? Do you support this mandatory national service? Let's look into some of the arguments. So, if you're in the pro team today, you want to kind of value the idea of patriotism, loving your country, and where it is important to put your country's best interests first. So, yes, it is important that individuals ask and individuals' needs are important, but when it comes to country as a whole, the country's interest must come before the individual. That's the value. Now, firstly, this argument you can say, look, there are a lot of benefits of going to the army. You can learn how to drive, you can learn how to be disciplined, you also get fit because you exercise, and this can have individual benefits. But not only that, it can have a national benefit because conscription or mandatory national service can bring people together by patriotism. People will start to love their country, value their country, because you know that you're protecting your country, so you have pride for that nation. And this is actually very good for that country as a whole. You can also say it enhances the defensive capability of the country. Say South Korea, when there's that constant tension between North and South Korea, the South Korea military must be strong. And if you completely move this into a voluntary military service, then obviously it's going to be bad because you're not going to have a lot of people who volunteer, and the military capability will go down. Same for Singapore or other nations which are smaller in size and might not have enough people to volunteer. Mandatory service will be beneficial. Also, you can say that military service can provide people with useful vocational skills. So I already said that, but like map reading skills, computer skills, operation skills, all of these skills are needed for you to be successful in your future. Last, also, it gives you confidence. And that's why some people who go through the armies are actually better disciplined and better equipped with the skill set to be successful in life. And that's why, as a whole, if you equip this type of discipline and vocational skills to individuals, this will benefit the country and its people. Now let's look at some of the con-side argument. Here you can say, look, it is individuals' right to choose. Now, what's really important as a background knowledge to this is that you can say, hey, you know what? Maybe back in the days where it's 1800s or 1900s or possibly World War II or World War One, in those ages, yes, having more people in the army translates to strong national defense. But that's not really true these days. Modern warfare, you use the drones, there's nuclear weapons, nuclear umbrella, there, and also there's UN and negotiation systems. So you don't necessarily need to actively have a number of people in the army all the time, and just forcing them is not really good. So there's a typo here, but it violates the idea of personal freedom. So, especially these days, people's freedom and rights are more recognized by a lot of nations. It's basic human rights. And if your religion or if your belief says that I'm not going to do actions that might potentially take away the life of other people, then why would the country force that individual to go to the mandatory military service? This is completely against the human rights of that individual. You can also say it can interfere with individual paths, education paths. So a lot of times, let's take Korea for example. You're in the second year or first year of university, but you have to take a 2 year off or even 3 years off, depending on when you go off uh, from the time of study, and then you go to you serve in the army, and this might interfere with your career path or educational path. And when you put the age, you put that gap, then the first starting year to work will be slower than others, and this might not be a good idea for some people who want to really achieve academically. It can also say it compromises the quality of the military service. If you put it into the voluntary military service, then people who really want to go to the army, people who believe that they can do well in the army, will volunteer to go to the army. But if you force everyone, not everyone will be a great soldier. Some people will not be fit for the army. So if you just have like 1,000 people who are just mediocre or who are just okay soldiers versus 100 really, really high trained, well soldiers. In modern warfare, there's so much, AI involved, drones involved, technologies involved. You rather want to work with, fewer military personnel who are highly, highly equipped and highly, highly skillful rather than thousands and hundred thousands of people who just go to the army and just for the sake of going to the army. Lastly, you can also put, you can say that if you send people to the military, it will put young people's lives at risk. We, as Korean, I did read a lot of newspaper that there's a lot of wrongdoings in the army where it's when you might meet someone who are in the army who are bad temper. Some people commit suicide there. And if you are sent to the place of war, you might have PSTD. You might be traumatized by the event, and you just put a lot of young people's lives at risk, and this is not good. And therefore, the country should not ask people to be put their lives into extreme risk just for having more number of people in the army. So those are the arguments. Now, I just want to recognize to and tell you all of you that this is not everything. So if you look up in the web, even in YouTube, there's a wealth of information about conscription services, history, the background, some people who are for it, against it. So my suggestion is this is a big topic. Please go and research a bit. Try to look at some of the arguments. Try to look at some of the examples. Some examples are in the reading, but not all. So suggest you look at a couple of examples to help on both sides to see why mandatory military service is good or bad. Okay, So that's all for the video today. And until then, I'll see you in debate. Thank you for watching my video. Bye bye.